In 35 years, one man erased 5 cities from the map. He didn't bomb them, he buried them, street by street, body by body. Tamerlane called it justice. The world called it a warning. At Sivas, he promised mercy. Not a single drop of blood shall be shed. And he kept that promise by having 4,000 men buried alive. That was only the beginning. Because every city that defied him would learn the same lesson. Mercy had rules, and he wrote them in dirt and bone. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The year was 1400. The city of Sivas sat in the cold heart of Anatolia, a fortress of faith, stone, and desperation. Inside its walls, a few thousand soldiers held their breath as the horizon turned black. Tamerlane's army had arrived, a moving continent of men, horses, and siege towers. They knew his name. Everyone did. Cities that resisted him were not defeated. They were deleted. When the first messenger came with an offer, it sounded like salvation. Tamerlane promised that no blood would be spilled, no massacre, no sword, only surrender. To men who had already seen their comrades die by the thousands, that promise sounded almost holy. They opened the gates. They stacked their weapons neatly in the dust, still believing that honor could be measured in oaths. But the pits were already waiting. Rows of trenches dug with careful geometry, long, deep, wide enough for thousands. They weren't graves yet. They were proof of planning. When the soldiers were herded toward them, confusion turned to dread. Then the earth began to move. Shovels, carts, the slow thunder of soil pouring down. No blades, no screams of battle, just the muffled panic of men suffocating beneath the weight of their own surrender. Some tried to claw their way up, some begged. But the dirt kept falling, sealing them in layers of silence. Tamerlane watched, and by the letter of his word, he had kept his promise. Not a drop of blood had been shed. The chroniclers recorded it as clever cruelty, but underneath the cleverness was something colder. Precision. This wasn't rage. It was a demonstration. Tamerlane wasn't just showing what he could do to a city. He was showing what he could do to language. He had turned mercy into a weapon of law, a contract that killed without violating its terms. When word of Sivas spread, other cities understood. Promises no longer meant safety. Peace could suffocate you just as easily as war. Tamerlane had found a new kind of terror, one that didn't need fire or blood, only obedience. Because in his empire, survival wasn't granted. It was negotiated. The burial at Sivas was not the worst thing he did. It was only the opening argument of his campaign. A warning written in soil, a promise that every future city would pay for defiance, not just in death, but in disappearance. When news of Sivas reached the east, it didn't travel as a rumor. It traveled as arithmetic. 4,000 men, no blood spilled, no survivors, no rebellion. To every city that heard it, the message was clear. Resistance was now a luxury few could afford. And yet, one city still believed it could survive him. Urgenk, jewel of Khwarezm, crossroads of the Silk Road, where scholars once debated under domes tiled in turquoise, and merchants spoke 10 languages in a single market square. It wasn't a fortress built for war, it was a civilization disguised as a city. But in 1388, Erdjinch made a fatal decision. It rebelled. At first, rebellion seemed reasonable. Tamerlane was far away, fighting elsewhere. The local rulers believed distance meant safety, that perhaps his legend had been exaggerated, the kind of terror chroniclers used to frighten their readers. They were wrong. When he returned, he didn't march with rage. He advanced with calculation. His army surrounded Erdjinch in silence. No speeches, no demands. The siege was short, not because the city lacked courage, but because it lacked comprehension. They still believed there would be terms, that even if they lost, they might negotiate survival. But Tamerlane didn't want submission this time. He wanted to make an example that would echo through centuries. When the walls finally broke, the slaughter began in perfect order. No chaos, no looting at first. The soldiers moved street by street, methodical as accountants. Men, women, children. It didn't matter. Death was distributed evenly, like taxation. Contemporary chronicles describe rivers of blood, but the truth is quieter and more terrible. The streets were lined with bodies, not because the killing was wild, but because it was efficient. Tamerlane had turned annihilation into an operation. Each unit cleared its assigned district. Each commander reported completion. There was no battle anymore, only management. When the killing ended, the next phase began. Erdjinch was to be erased not just as a population, but as an idea. Houses were dismantled. Mosques, even the great ones, were leveled stone by stone. Libraries were emptied, their manuscripts burned or scattered to the wind. The city's irrigation canals, its veins of life, were clogged with corpses and rubble. This was not destruction for pleasure. It was strategic obliteration. Because in Tamerlane's philosophy of empire, a city that resisted was not merely disobedient, it was diseased. And disease could not be ruled. It could only be removed. He stayed long enough to watch the end himself. Then he gave one final order. The ruins were to be ploughed, the soil turned, and over what was once the capital of Khwarezm, barley was to be sown. That single act, planting crops where streets once stood, became one of the most chilling gestures in all imperial history. It meant that Erdjinch was no longer a city, not even a ruin. It was farmland now, anonymous, fertile, erased. Archaeologists centuries later found traces of this. The outlines of flattened walls, grain pollen embedded in soil layers where homes had been. No rebuilding followed, no survivors returned. Erdjinch had been converted into a field. The symbolism was precise. Barley was the crop of sustenance, the food of soldiers, of empire. To sow it over a city was to turn civilization itself into rations. A reminder that even culture could be consumed to feed conquest. In the silence that followed, merchants stopped mentioning Erdjinch in their ledgers. Mapmakers left a blank where it used to be. And for the first time in memory, an empire didn't just rule over people. It rewrote geography. For Tamerlane, the destruction of Erdjinch was not vengeance. It was a statement of authorship. He wasn't just taking territory. He was deciding what reality should remember. To erase a city was to erase its narrative, its language, its gods, its claim to history. The empire of Tamerlane was not expanding by conquest alone. It was expanding by editing. Chronicles written decades later would still whisper about that field of barley. Some said it grew too well, unnaturally green, fed by the dead beneath. Others claimed no one dared harvest it, as if each grain carried a memory of what had been buried below. Whether those stories were true didn't matter. They proved the point. Tamerlane had destroyed the city so completely that its ghost had to speak through legend. In a strange way, that was his brilliance. He understood that fear outlives fact. No army could conquer every frontier, but terror could. A story of one erased city could travel farther than any soldier. And so, Urgench became a message, not to his enemies, but to the world. It told rulers what defiance would cost. It told citizens that loyalty meant survival. It told history that the power to destroy was also the power to define. The chroniclers recorded numbers: 30,000, 40,000, who could say? But numbers were never the real currency. The true victory was psychological. Every city that surrendered after Urgench was ruled by that silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from understanding that resistance had been mathematically erased from possibility. And still, this was only the second act, because Tamerlane was not finished. He had buried armies and planted over cities, but the next lesson he would teach was far more intimate. It would happen in Isfahan, a city that believed surrender would save it, and discovered too late that in Tamerlane's empire, mercy was not the opposite of punishment. It was the punishment. By the time Tamerlane reached Isfahan in 1387, his reputation had already arrived first. The city was one of Persia's brightest lights. Mosques of blue tile, gardens fed by clever canals, markets heavy with silk and silver. It had survived Mongols, plagues, and invasions before. But when news spread that Tamerlane's banners were approaching, Isfahan didn't wait to fight. Its leaders made what seemed like the only rational choice. They surrendered. No resistance, no siege. They opened the gates and offered gifts: gold, horses, manuscripts, even trained artisans to buy safety. And for a while, it worked. Tamerlane accepted their surrender. He stationed a small garrison, appointed tax collectors, and declared the city spared. For a few weeks, life resumed its rhythm. Markets reopened. Scholars returned to their lectures. The people whispered that perhaps the conqueror wasn't the monster they'd been told he was. They were wrong. It began with a tax. A heavy one, but not unbearable. When collectors went door to door, tempers rose. An argument turned into a fight turned into a riot. By dusk, the streets of Isfahan were running red, not with the blood of soldiers, but with that of Tamerlane's own garrison. The citizens had killed his men, believing that an act of rebellion could reclaim their dignity. When word reached Tamerlane, his reaction was not fury, it was calculation. A promise had been broken, and in his logic, mercy could no longer apply. If Sivas had taught the world that surrender didn't guarantee safety, Isfahan would teach that rebellion after mercy was an unpardonable sin. His army surrounded the city again. This time, there were no negotiations. The gates that once opened freely were torn down. His soldiers entered in perfect formation, thousands moving as one, like a tide with orders. What followed wasn't chaos, it was procedure. Tamerlane ordered every unit to account for its actions. Every squad was given a target. A district, a street, a quota. 2 severed heads per man, not prisoners, not bodies, heads. The massacre began. Soldiers dragged families into the streets, killed them, then moved to the next house. There were no cries for surrender because no one believed surrender existed anymore. For 2 days, the killing didn't stop. When it did, tens of thousands were dead. Chroniclers argued about numbers. Some wrote 200,000, others 70,000. But numbers don't describe what came next. The heads were collected, all of them. And Tamerlane gave his architects a new assignment: build towers, not of stone, but of skulls. 28 towers, each thousands of faces high, constructed at the city gates, along main roads, beside mosques. They weren't meant to honor the dead. They were meant to instruct the living. A warning that mercy could only be granted once and never revoked. Eyewitnesses said the towers shone white under the sun, and at night, when the wind blew through the hollow eye sockets, the city itself seemed to whisper. The chronicler Nizam al-Din Shami, who followed Tamerlane's campaigns, described the scene briefly before breaking off. He couldn't finish the count. He simply wrote, "The stench overcame me." Isfahan became more than a massacre. It became policy. A place where terror was measured, catalogued, and built into architecture. Every person who passed through the city, merchant, pilgrim, diplomat, saw those towers first. You didn't need a translator to understand what they said. Disobedience was not punished. It was erased, displayed, and left to rot as public art. To Tamerlane, this was efficiency. Fear was faster than conquest. Every skull he used was one battle he wouldn't have to fight later. Every rumor of Isfahan's towers carried his authority farther than his armies could march. And so, in the empire of fear he was building, the Skull Tower wasn't a monument to horror. It was infrastructure, the architecture of submission. The psychological effect was immediate. When news reached neighboring cities, governors wrote to him preemptively, offering tribute before his armies arrived. They didn't wait for threats. They didn't plan defenses. They simply surrendered. From that point on, Tamerlane didn't need to burn every city. He just needed to remind them that he could. The towers of Isfahan had made him omnipresent. But behind the precision of his terror lay a deeper logic. He didn't see cruelty as chaos. He saw it as order, the visible expression of his right to rule. Where others built empires with roads and taxes, he built his with symbols that no one could ignore. And yet, there was a problem even fear couldn't solve. Fear could make people obey, but it couldn't make them productive. An empire of silence cannot trade, cannot grow, cannot live. It only waits. As Tamerlane's forces left Isfahan, the towers still stood. The city was silent, its air thick with rot and flies. No one dared take them down. For years they remained, slowly collapsing, skulls whitening in the sun. Children born after the massacre grew up beneath those towers. To them, the architecture of death wasn't history, it was the horizon. And still, Tamerlane was not done. The lesson of Isfahan had worked too well. Fear had become its own fuel, feeding his ambition to test how far erasure could go. Next, he would turn his attention south, toward a land richer than any he'd taken before. A city legendary for its power and its elephants, Delhi, where the mathematics of death would reach its purest form. By 1398, Tamerlane had conquered most of Central Asia and Persia. He was 60 years old, too old, some said, to keep fighting. But for men like him, conquest wasn't a phase of life, it was the reason to exist. His eyes turned south, toward India, the Delhi Sultanate, a realm so wealthy that even its dust glittered with gold. Delhi was more than a city. It was legend, bazaars overflowing with silk and jewels, war elephants plated in iron, and palaces that mirrored the sun. It was also a challenge. If he could take Delhi, he wouldn't just be a conqueror. He would be the axis of two worlds, the steppe and the sultanate, the sword and the scripture. He announced his justification. The sultans of Delhi, he claimed, were too lenient toward their Hindu subjects. It was a pretext, religion as paperwork. The real motive was wealth and demonstration. His army, 90,000 strong, crossed the Indus like a moving continent. They didn't march, they consumed. Villages vanished behind them, fields burned, and survivors chained together in columns stretching miles long. By the time he reached the outskirts of Delhi, his army wasn't just soldiers. It was a tide of prisoners, slaves, and stolen goods. One chronicler wrote that Tamerlane's camp contained over 100,000 captives, men, women, and children, the living debris of conquest. It was a logistical nightmare. Prisoners needed food, guards, and order. And on the eve of battle, they became a liability. If the captives rose while his army fought the Sultan, he could be surrounded. An army in front, a rebellion behind. So, he made a decision that only Tamerlane could make. He issued one simple command: kill them all, not in battle, not as punishment, just to make the numbers work. That night, the camp became a slaughterhouse. Every soldier was ordered to execute his assigned captives. Some used swords, some ropes. Some burned entire groups alive to finish faster. The earth soaked until it couldn't drink anymore. One chronicler wrote, "The blood formed rivulets." Another said, "The ground became mud, red and deep." 100,000 human beings erased in a single night. The next morning, there was silence. And then the march continued. When Tamerlane reached Delhi, the Sultan's army waited, 120 war elephants armored in steel, their tusks tipped with poison and fire. They were the pride of India's battlefield, massive beasts meant to break enemy lines through panic. But Tamerlane had done his research. He knew the elephant's weakness. Before dawn, he ordered bundles of hay and dry grass strapped to the backs of his camels. When the elephants charged, the camels were set ablaze and driven forward. Imagine the scene. A wall of flaming animals shrieking into the battlefield, smoke thick enough to blot the sky, the elephants panicking, turning, stampeding backward through their own army, crushing men and horses alike. Delhi fell not to numbers, but to terror's reflection. Tamerlane weaponizing chaos itself. Once the gates broke, the sack of Delhi began. 5 days, not of battle, but of calculation. Each street became a ledger of death. Every neighborhood was assigned to a unit. They looted first, killed second, burned third. There was no rage, no frenzy, only procedure. Tamerlane sat in his tent and received reports. Silver weighed, prisoners counted, temples stripped. Delhi's palaces, once echoing with music, filled with screams. Mosques became holding pens for slaves. Libraries turned into fuel. The smoke was so thick that one chronicle says the sun disappeared for 2 days. Afterward, his soldiers gathered the spoils: gold, silk, ivory, manuscripts, and artisans, thousands of them, sent back to Samarkand to build his capital of marble and blue tile. And when the killing was over, Delhi ceased to function. The survivors fled, leaving only stray dogs and vultures among corpses. For weeks, no one entered the city. The stench was unbearable. Chroniclers wrote that even the wind avoided it. In the final humiliation, Tamerlane captured 90 of the war elephants, symbols of Delhi's pride, and forced them to carry the stones for his new mosque in Samarkand. The beasts that had once trampled his enemies now built his monuments. It was domination in its purest form, not just the victory of a man over a city, but of will over memory. Delhi was not conquered, it was repurposed. And yet, for all the blood and treasure he claimed, Tamerlane had also exposed the limits of his own empire. A city destroyed could not pay tribute. A civilization erased could not serve. But logic was never his compass. Reputation was. Delhi became a myth in itself, a warning so large that even faraway kings paid him not to visit. In the empire he built, fear was currency, and Delhi was its mint. The chroniclers called him the Sword of God. But those who walked among the ruins understood something else entirely. Tamerlane had found a way to rule without ruling, to control without presence. Because once you've shown that no city is too sacred to burn, you don't need to conquer the next one. It will kneel before you arrive. Delhi had been erased, but Tamerlane's true masterpiece was still ahead. A city that would pay for defiance with more than its life. Baghdad, the heart of a civilization, and soon its grave. Baghdad was not just a city, it was a world, the center of Islamic learning, the heart of an empire that had once ruled from Spain to India. Poets called it the City of Peace. By the time Tamerlane arrived in 1401, that peace was already fragile. But what he did next would end more than a city. It would end an idea, the belief that civilization could protect itself from barbarity through knowledge. The city had surrendered once before. Years earlier, its rulers had knelt before him, paid their tribute, and sworn loyalty. But when Tamerlane left to fight elsewhere, Baghdad's governor made a fatal mistake. He rose against him, believing distance meant freedom. It was the same miscalculation Urgench had made, and this time, Tamerlane would ensure that no one repeated it again. The siege lasted 40 days. The city's defenders fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered, surrounded, and starved. When the gates finally broke, there was no battle cry, no charge, only the sound of thousands of boots moving in unison. The order had already been given. Each soldier was to return with 2 severed heads. Not trophies, proof. It was a quota, and failure was not tolerated. The massacre that followed wasn't spontaneous. It was methodical, transactional, and horrifyingly quiet. Soldiers moved from house to house with the precision of tax collectors. They killed, counted, and moved on. In some accounts, even the soldiers who hesitated were executed by their own officers for not meeting their quota. Chroniclers later estimated the dead at 90,000. Others said 20,000. But the numbers barely matter. The truth was simpler. Killing had become a job description. Men dragged captives into the streets, then decapitated them in lines, the way an empire might weigh grain or tally taxes. Bodies piled in courtyards, heads rolled into carts. And still the counting continued. The killing was so relentless that one chronicler wrote of soldiers who, running out of victims, killed their own slaves to complete their quota. Others, desperate to meet their count, murdered prisoners they could have ransomed. Even their wives, some claimed, were not safe. Whether true or not, the rumor itself was enough. It meant that in Tamerlane's empire, even love could not survive bureaucracy. When the quotas were met, the soldiers began their next assignment: construction. Tamerlane ordered the heads to be used as building materials. Tower after tower rose above the smoking ruins, white and silent, shimmering under the sun. The chroniclers counted over 100, each one a monument of obedience. To most, it looked like madness, but to Tamerlane, it was administration. Each tower was an entry in his imperial ledger, a record of submission measured in human lives. Because what mattered wasn't how many he killed. What mattered was that the world saw that killing had rules, and that he alone could decide them. He spared the mosques and shrines, not out of mercy, but to stage the illusion of divine order. In his version of faith, God's houses would remain untouched, surrounded by ruins, as if even heaven acknowledged his authority. From the minarets, the call to prayer still echoed over the ruins, but no one answered. There was no one left to pray. For the survivors, the sight of the skull towers was unbearable. Children who escaped the slaughter would grow up haunted by their outlines on the horizon, the white bone catching the dawn light like frost. Each gust of wind turned the hollow skulls into flutes of the dead. And through that sound, Tamerlane achieved what no conqueror before him had managed. He turned terror into a system of governance. Every future ruler in the region understood the lesson. If you wanted to rule through fear, you didn't need to fight every battle. You just needed to count the dead, and make sure everyone else could too. Because once death becomes measurable, it also becomes legitimate. That was the philosophy of his empire. Fear wasn't chaos, it was bureaucracy. When the slaughter ended, Tamerlane rode through the city in silence. His generals followed behind, their horses stepping over the ashes of scholars, merchants, mothers, children, the population of a civilization. There were no cheers, no victory speeches, only dust. He stopped in front of the largest of the skull towers. One chronicler claims he looked up at it for a long time, then ordered a small brass plaque to be set at its base. Its inscription, according to legend, read, "Thus ends the arrogance of cities." Whether the plaque existed or not, the meaning did. Baghdad was gone, not burned, not conquered, but neutralized. It had been transformed from a city of light into a monument to compliance. And when he left, the towers remained, bleaching under the desert sun, long after the empire began to crumble. Because Tamerlane understood something that most kings never learned. Monuments don't preserve glory, they preserve fear. The towers of Baghdad stood for decades. Travelers wrote of them, merchants whispered of their smell, and poets avoided their names. Every rumor, every shiver, was a victory that didn't require another sword stroke. By the time he returned to Samarkand, Tamerlane's empire stretched from the Mediterranean to the Himalayas. But it wasn't the land he conquered that mattered. It was the imagination. He had colonized fear itself. And yet, empires built on fear decay faster than stone. Terror can keep a city silent, but it cannot make it loyal. Tamerlane would die just a few years later, planning one final conquest: China. He never made it, but his towers outlived him, and his method, the arithmetic of fear, would outlive even his bloodline. The question that history still struggles to answer is simple. When killing becomes order and cruelty becomes law, does civilization end, or does it finally reveal what it truly is? The towers were never meant to last, but for years after Tamerlane's death, travelers still saw them. White spires of skulls standing on the edges of ruined cities, their silence louder than any victory anthem. From Isfahan to Baghdad, from the fields of Delhi to the plains of Anatolia, each monument carried the same message. Power does not need to speak if it can be seen. Tamerlane had turned violence into architecture. The Skull Tower was not only a threat, it was infrastructure, a new kind of city planning, one built not for the living but for the memory of fear. The logic was simple. A wall can fall, but terror survives its own destruction. Each tower outlived its purpose. Even when they collapsed, even when the bones turned to dust, the story remained, whispered, retold, reshaped into warning. For the merchants of the Silk Road, those towers were landmarks. Caravans noted them on maps. Pass here, where the city once stood. The coordinates of absence. And that was the genius of his design. Every erased city became a marker of his presence. He ruled not through borders, but through memory. Historians sometimes call it propaganda, but that word feels too small. Propaganda is persuasion. This was possession. He didn't just want obedience. He wanted to occupy the imagination, permanently. The chroniclers, unable to look away, became part of the architecture too. They documented every act, every horror, thinking they were condemning him. But by writing, they preserved him. Each record, each line, each trembling word was another brick in the monument he built for himself. And in this sense, the architecture of Tamerlane's empire wasn't made of stone. It was made of repetition. Stories as scaffolding, memory as mortar. In Samarkand, the city he spared and beautified, he constructed the opposite of what he had destroyed. Glittering domes, blue mosaics, madrasas filled with scholars brought from the cities he'd erased. Some came willingly, most did not. Their hands rebuilt what his armies had annihilated. The same masons who once carved prayer niches in Isfahan now laid tile for his mosques. The same scribes who wrote poetry in Delhi now copied the Quran for his court. Their art became trophies, their skills, reparations. It was a cruel symmetry. For every tower of skulls, there was a dome of turquoise. Both spoke the same language. One whispered of submission through beauty. The other screamed it through horror. Together they told the truth of Tamerlane's vision, that civilization and cruelty were not opposites. They were collaborators. He had proven that the same hands that built could also bury, and that fear could coexist with admiration. Visitors marveled at his capital, the palaces, the observatories, the shimmering tilework, never realizing that every color, every curve, was financed by annihilation. Even centuries later, when empires rose and fell over his ruins, the pattern repeated: build glory, erase the witnesses. It was as if his method had become a blueprint for power itself. Modern historians still argue over his motives. Some call him a military genius, others a butcher. But the truth lies somewhere colder. Tamerlane was neither mad nor moral. He was structural. He treated conquest as architecture, each city an experiment in destruction and design. He understood that you could shape behavior not only with armies, but with symbols that outlasted them. Fear was his material. Memory was his mortar. The towers themselves were practical in another sense. They didn't just frighten. They saved him time, money, and soldiers. Every traveler who saw them spread the message for free. No empire had ever found a cheaper way to rule. And yet, buried beneath that precision was something almost human, a need to be remembered. Because even his cruelty was staged for an audience. He didn't want to be forgotten like the countless kings before him. He wanted his name to echo through time, even if the echo was made of screams. In that, he succeeded. 600 years later, the skull towers are gone, but the silence they created still lingers. Every historian who writes his name, every viewer who listens to his story, is part of the same architecture he designed, a monument rebuilt in words. What he constructed wasn't just fear, it was endurance. He proved that terror, when organized and documented, outlives its maker. But the question that remains is darker. Can a civilization admire its own monsters and still call itself civilized? The ruins of Isfahan, the barley fields of Urgench, the empty streets of Delhi, they all whisper the same answer. Tamerlane didn't destroy the world. He showed it what it was willing to become. Because in every age, some ruler learns to build monuments from bones, and some people learn to look at them and call it order. Behind every skull tower, behind every smouldering ruin, there was an account book. Tamerlane didn't rule through madness. He ruled through numbers. Every campaign, every massacre, every city leveled to dust was also a transaction, a calculation of cost, yield, and message. For him, terror wasn't chaos, it was investment. When a city was destroyed, its walls became stone for new mosques. Its artisans became captives for Samarkand. Its gold paid the soldiers, and its silence, its absence, increased the value of fear. It's easy to see cruelty as senseless. But Tamerlane's cruelty always had a budget. He built an empire not on taxes, but on plunder. He didn't need stable trade routes or long-term governance. He needed flow, the constant influx of wealth ripped from one city and redirected into another. Each invasion funded the next. Each destroyed city provided the labor and resources for the one he wanted to build. Samarkand, his capital, became a living museum of conquest. Its architects came from Persia, its artisans from India, its engineers from Syria, its astronomers from Baghdad. They all worked under the same sun in a city that glittered because everything around it had burned. Visitors marveled at it, the Redefined square, the gardens, the turquoise domes. They called it the mirror of the world. But in truth, it was a mosaic of ruins. Each stone was taken from a place that no longer existed. The irony was brutal. His glory depended on other people's extinction. He couldn't build without first destroying. To feed this machine, he created what we might call a medieval logistics of atrocity. Caravans moved not only goods, but prisoners. Accountants recorded loot by weight. Scribes catalogued the names of captives by trade. Every massacre was followed by a census. Every act of horror was written down. Tamerlane's empire, for all its blood, ran with bureaucratic efficiency. In many ways, it anticipated the machinery of later empires, where violence became a department and extermination a form of record-keeping. Even the division of spoils followed a fixed formula. 1/5 of all booty went directly to him. The rest was divided by rank, a financial pyramid built on conquest. Obedience was profitable, and so was terror. Because fear wasn't just psychological currency, it was economic leverage. Cities that surrendered paid tribute to avoid destruction. Those tributes, gold, livestock, slaves, became the empire's cash flow. The threat of annihilation was the most efficient tax collector in history. That's how he could wage endless war without running out of money. He didn't need stability. He only needed fear to circulate faster than faith. His scribes even recorded the profits. In 1399, after the sack of Delhi, the value of captured gold and jewels was so great that the price of gold dropped across Central Asia for 2 years. Imagine that, a single massacre altering the regional economy. Behind that prosperity, though, was collapse. Fields untended, trade routes abandoned, towns depopulated. The empire fed on its own destruction. But for as long as he lived, the arithmetic worked, and people, from soldiers to scholars, participated in it willingly. Merchants followed his armies, buying loot cheap and selling it far away. Smiths melted stolen metal into new currency. Even clerics blessed his campaigns, arguing that plunder from unbelievers was not theft, but purification. In this way, the empire became complicit. Atrocity turned into industry. Death acquired supply chains. From execution pits to palace construction, every act of horror had a use. It's tempting to call that hypocrisy, but it was something colder. It was the recognition that moral systems can coexist perfectly with economic ones, as long as both are profitable. And yet, there was a limit. By the final years of his life, Tamerlane's territories stretched too wide to manage. Trade dwindled, harvests failed, and the tribute stopped flowing. Fear was still powerful, but fear alone cannot plant crops or fill granaries. Even his capital began to strain under the weight of its splendor. Imported artisans died faster than they could be replaced. Entire provinces existed only to feed Samarkand's appetite for beauty. The economy of atrocity was collapsing under its own logic. You cannot profit forever from destruction. Eventually, there is nothing left to destroy. And yet, Tamerlane kept planning. He dreamed of a final campaign, an invasion of China so vast it would eclipse everything before. But before he could march, the machine he built finally broke. In 1405, on the road to the Chinese frontier, he died in winter, surrounded not by enemies, but by silence. His empire stopped expanding that day, not because it was defeated, but because there was nothing left to conquer that still had value. The man who had built towers from skulls and turned massacre into mathematics was buried in Samarkand, in a tomb of jade and gold, funded by the ghosts of the world he had consumed. And yet, even in death, his method endured. For centuries after, kings and conquerors studied his campaigns, not for their brutality, but for their efficiency. They didn't ask why he killed. They asked how. That's the legacy of the economy of atrocity. Once violence becomes a system, it never truly dies. It just finds new accountants. Tamerlane was not a godless butcher. That's the mistake his enemies made, and his chroniclers corrected. He prayed, he fasted, he built mosques. He called himself the Sword of Islam, and in doing so, he discovered the most enduring tool of power. When faith blesses the sword, resistance becomes heresy. He claimed to fight in the name of divine order, to cleanse the world of corruption and false belief. Every campaign began not with a declaration of war, but with a sermon. Before marching, his heralds read verses from the Quran, and his scribes recorded them in gold ink, proof that conquest was holy work. But beneath the scripture, there was strategy. Religion gave his empire something terror alone could not: structure. It turned fear into morality. It made obedience sacred. When his armies slaughtered the people of Delhi, he justified it by saying they had insulted Islam. When he razed Baghdad, he claimed the city had abandoned true piety. And when he ploughed over Urgench, he called it purification. For every skull tower, there was a verse. For every massacre, a prayer. The theologians of his court followed this logic easily. They declared that Tamerlane's victories were signs of divine favor, and his enemies' suffering, divine punishment. To them, the success of his campaigns proved his righteousness. After all, why would God let the wicked prevail? It was an ancient formula, one that turned conquest into revelation. When armies win, heaven approves. When cities burn, heaven judges. And once that link was forged, Tamerlane no longer had to justify his acts. He only had to win. But it wasn't faith alone that held his empire together. It was the way he fused faith with bureaucracy. He wrote laws that turned loyalty into theology. His subjects were not only expected to obey the ruler, they were expected to obey the order itself. Disobedience was not rebellion, it was sin. Every Friday sermon in every mosque across his lands was required to mention his name. The faithful prayed not only to God, but for Tamerlane, as if his rule was a divine condition for peace. The words echoed from Samarkand to Aleppo. May God protect the shadow of the Sultan on earth. It was a simple sentence, but in it lay the entire philosophy of his rule. God's mercy flowed through hierarchy, and in that hierarchy, Tamerlane stood closest to the divine. In his view, submission wasn't humiliation, it was salvation. To defy him was to defy the order of creation. He had inverted theology. Obedience became virtue, and fear became faith. The chroniclers, even the ones who despised him, could not escape that logic. When they described his massacres, they ended their pages with, "And God knows best." The phrase that once meant humility became a seal of surrender. It's easy, centuries later, to call that hypocrisy. But in Tamerlane's time, it was survival. The scholars and imams who served him were not fools or fanatics. They were functionaries. They understood that scripture could protect them better than walls. They adapted to his rule the way water adapts to stone. One jurist, in a surviving letter, wrote, "The Sultan's justice is like the sun. It burns, but it gives life." It was a sentence written in self-preservation, and yet it reveals everything. Even the witnesses to terror could not stop themselves from translating it into meaning. That was Tamerlane's genius. He didn't forbid thought. He redirected it. He turned intellect itself into an instrument of obedience. Philosophers debated his lineage. Poets praised his mercy. Architects built mosques in his name, with verses about paradise carved into their walls, while slaves, stolen from conquered cities, died building them. In Samarkand's Grand Mosque, he had an inscription placed above the entrance. "The shadow of God extends across the earth." Visitors admired its beauty. Few stopped to ask whose bones lay beneath its foundations. The theology of obedience was complete. Faith no longer restrained power, it justified it. And once belief was captured, there was nothing left to resist. Even those who hated him had to admit that his empire functioned. Caravans traveled safely under his banners. Law courts reopened under his name. Trade resumed. But everything that moved, gold, goods, even ideas, moved under his shadow. Fear had become orderly. Terror had become divine administration. That was the paradox of his reign. He destroyed civilization to prove he could govern it better. He killed scholars, then hired their students. He burned libraries, then built new ones to preserve what he approved of. He was both the executioner and the editor. And when the faithful prayed, they didn't ask to be delivered from him. They asked to be delivered through him. By the end of his life, Tamerlane had conquered not only land and wealth, but the language of morality itself. He no longer needed to terrify. The people terrified themselves. Because once obedience becomes sacred, you don't need chains. You only need prayer. And in that silence between fear and worship, his empire endured. A kingdom where mercy, law, and faith all wore the same mask. To understand Tamerlane, one must first abandon the idea that he was a madman. Madness is random. His violence was not. Every act of horror he committed followed a pattern, deliberate, symbolic, almost architectural. He didn't kill for pleasure or even revenge. He killed to communicate. His empire was built not on land, but on perception. And perception, in his hands, was a weapon sharper than any sword. Historians often call him a master of psychological warfare, but the term feels too clean. What he practiced was deeper, a kind of emotional engineering. He understood that power wasn't about armies, it was about anticipation. If people feared what he might do, he didn't have to do it. That's why his campaigns were designed like performances. Every siege was a stage, every massacre a message. The skull towers were not monuments, they were communication systems. They transmitted terror across deserts and languages without a single word. By the time his army approached a city, its defenders already knew the script. They'd heard the stories, seen the traders who returned pale and shaking, watched the refugees too traumatized to speak. That was his real army, rumor. He weaponized imagination. Where other kings sent emissaries, he sent silence. Where they negotiated, he let memory negotiate for him. Even his mercy followed logic. He spared some cities not out of compassion, but to create contrast. Mercy, in his empire, was the exception that made fear believable. If everyone died, terror would lose its tension. If some lived, everyone would still obey. He once told an envoy, "A man who knows I can destroy him at any moment will serve me forever." That sentence explains his entire psychology. Control wasn't about cruelty. It was about certainty, making others believe that their survival depended on his moods, and that those moods were law. He didn't need his enemies to hate him. He needed them to calculate him. And that's what made him unstoppable. Tamerlane's contemporaries described him as calm, courteous, and even charming. He could quote poetry, discuss philosophy, debate theology. He surrounded himself with scholars and often spared the lives of artisans and mathematicians. But these gestures weren't contradictions. They were extensions of his method. He knew that culture beautified fear. When artists praise a conqueror, terror becomes heritage. In Samarkand, he would walk among the scholars and poets he had imported from ruined cities, listening to their verses, praising their intellect. They would flatter him in turn, calling him the restorer of order. And in a sense, he was. He didn't invent cruelty. He merely organized it. To his followers, he embodied destiny, a man chosen by God to cleanse the world. To his enemies, he was inevitability, a storm that could not be reasoned with. And to himself, he was neither tyrant nor saint. He was necessary. That word, necessary, appears again and again in the writings of those who served him. As if destruction were a form of maintenance. As if his massacres were repairs to the moral fabric of the world. This is how power sustains itself. Not by denying evil, but by rationalizing it. In his letters to foreign rulers, Tamerlane's tone was never frantic. He wrote like a clerk balancing accounts. "Those who obey me will live in peace," he told one sultan, "and those who resist will be erased." No threats, no emotion, just a choice. He made every decision sound like law, and that made resistance sound like chaos. Even his limp, the injury that earned him the name Timur the Lame, became part of his legend. He turned a physical weakness into symbolism. He would say, "I am lame in body, but my will walks straight." To his men, that meant divine selection, a visible flaw to prove invisible perfection. He mastered contrast, fragile body, unstoppable ambition, violence and refinement, prayer and annihilation. That tension made him fascinating and unforgettable. But beneath the charisma was isolation. He trusted no one completely. He executed his own allies when they grew too powerful. He rotated generals to prevent loyalty from forming anywhere but to him. He understood what every ruler eventually learns. Fear unites longer than friendship. And yet, fear corrodes from within. Toward the end of his life, Tamerlane ruled over a landscape of ash and silence. There were no rebellions, but no joy either. His courtiers obeyed his words, but avoided his eyes. He had achieved perfect control, and in doing so, erased everything worth controlling. Perhaps that was the final irony of his reign. He built a system so efficient at eliminating disobedience that it eliminated vitality too. Cities that once pulsed with trade became memorials. Subjects who once sang praises now whispered them, afraid of their own volume. power had consumed everything, even its reflection. And when he finally died, there were no uprisings, no cheers, no tears, only relief, whispered quietly behind closed doors. He left behind no philosophy, no code, no vision of justice, only a method, a proof that fear, once systematized, can hold the world still for a generation. But that stillness is not peace, it is suspension. And the moment the tyrant dies, gravity returns. Because fear cannot build, it can only delay collapse. Tamerlane's psychology was not of a man who loved cruelty. It was of a man who mistook control for creation. He didn't want to rule people. He wanted to sculpt them, until the only thing left to sculpt was dust. When Tamerlane died in the winter of 1405, his armies were already on the road east, a final campaign against China that would never happen. The man who had burned half the world was stopped not by an enemy, but by cold. He died in his tent near Otrar, wrapped in furs, surrounded by silence. No last battle, no glorious farewell. Only the creak of frozen canvas and the sound of horses shifting in the snow. For a ruler who had conquered continents, his death was almost domestic. No armies thundered, no prayers thundered either. The soldiers who carried his body back to Samarkand marched through towns too empty to mourn. He left behind an empire that stretched from the Black Sea to the Himalayas. But it was an empire of ashes. In the months after his death, the machinery of fear began to fail. There were no orders, no quotas, no central will to enforce obedience. Governors hesitated, commanders defected, tax collectors were killed in the streets. The silence that had once held the empire together fractured into whispers of rebellion. Fear had kept people frozen, but it had never taught them how to function without the man who inspired it. Cities that had obeyed Tamerlane out of terror now found themselves unable to obey anyone else. The empire did not collapse with a war, it simply unraveled, quietly, efficiently, the same way it had been built. His descendants, the Timurid princes, fought over what was left. Each one claimed divine right. Each one invoked the same old sermons about destiny and law. But none possessed his presence, his precision, or his cruelty. And so the empire splintered into inheritance, into small, brilliant fragments. Herat, Shiraz, Samarkand, each ruled by a son or grandson trying to outshine the other. Oddly, in that chaos, art flourished. The very bloodline of the conqueror who erased cities gave rise to a golden age of miniature painting, calligraphy, and astronomy. The scholars and artists he had once enslaved now served his descendants willingly. It was as if, in his absence, the energy that had fueled destruction sought a gentler outlet. The empire that began with towers of skulls ended with towers of ink and verse. But those achievements couldn't hide the truth. Tamerlane's system had never been sustainable. His rule depended on movement, on endless conquest to feed the machine. The moment it stopped moving, it began to decay. Trade routes once safe under his armies filled with bandits. Irrigation canals clogged. The bazaars of Samarkand grew quiet. Merchants, frightened of new taxes and unstable rulers, took their caravans elsewhere. The empire had devoured its own foundation. Its prosperity was built on ashes, and ashes cannot yield crops. Even the city of Samarkand, his masterpiece, began to lose its glow. The turquoise domes cracked in the heat. The fountains dried. The slaves who had built its beauty were gone, and no one was left to repair what they had made. In time, travelers came from Persia and Anatolia and found the capital eerily still. A magnificent skeleton, a city too proud to die, too empty to live. They visited his mausoleum, the Gur-i-Amir, and stood before the jade tomb carved with words he had chosen himself. When I rise from the dead, the world will tremble. It was an epitaph written like a threat. Even in death, he couldn't stop commanding. And in a sense, it was true. Centuries later, when archaeologists opened the tomb in 1941, a Soviet expedition recorded an inscription and said to warn, "Whoever opens this will unleash an invader worse than me." 2 days later, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Coincidence, perhaps. But the myth proved something deeper. Tamerlane's power had survived as fear. Even his bones inspired caution. No empire built on terror survives long, but its shadow lasts. The stories of his massacres, his towers, his promises, his ledgers, they became part of the landscape. Farmers still ploughed the barley fields of Urgench, never digging too deep. Children in Isfahan grew up hearing the wind whistle through invisible towers. The soil itself seemed haunted by arithmetic, by the memory of how precisely one man had counted lives. And yet, time, relentless and indifferent, did what armies could not. It erased even him. The towers fell, the walls of Samarkand faded, the empire dissolved into dust and rumour. All that remained was the method, the logic of fear as order. Other rulers would learn from it. They would study his campaigns, his efficiency, his control through reputation. They would copy his system without knowing whose ghost they served. The Empire of Ashes was gone, but the blueprint remained, and history would keep repeating it. From palaces to prisons, from ancient capitals to modern states, the same pattern, endlessly refined. Destroy, document, rebuild, and call it civilization. Tamerlane's empire didn't just collapse, it decomposed, absorbed by history, its nutrients feeding every ruler who ever believed that cruelty, if organized well enough, could last forever. Centuries passed. The bones of Tamerlane's victims turned to dust. The barley fields grew over their graves, and the turquoise domes of Samarkand faded beneath storms of sand. But the stories didn't fade. They hardened, fossilized into legend. Tamerlane was dead, but he had achieved something rarer than conquest. He had achieved continuity. His cruelty became memory, and memory became immortality. No one prayed to him. No temples bore his name. But his shadow stretched across history, quiet, persistent, unkillable. Merchants still whispered his name on the Silk Road when crossing dangerous passes. Sultans cited him in letters to frighten rivals. Even centuries later, when the Mughal Empire rose in India, its emperors claimed descent from him, as if cruelty itself could be inherited as legitimacy. The irony was perfect. His descendants built gardens, libraries, and observatories. They called themselves Timurids and ruled with grace, art, and intellect, as if to redeem the blood that founded them. But behind every dome and poem lay the same question. Can beauty ever cleanse the origin of terror? Historians have long debated his legacy. Was he a savage destroyer or a brilliant strategist? A visionary uniting the fractured lands of Central Asia, or a butcher who left civilization in ruins? The answer, perhaps, is both. Because history does not remember intentions. It remembers consequences. And Tamerlane's greatest creation was not his empire, but the fear that outlived it. He had understood something that philosophers would take centuries to articulate. Power doesn't die when you lose it. It dies when people stop fearing it. And his fear had become timeless. When his name appeared in chronicles, it was written with caution. Not because scribes feared him still, but because his image carried weight. Even dead, he commanded restraint. Over the centuries, his legend changed shape. In Persia, he was a divine scourge. In Europe, a barbarian of apocalyptic proportion. In Turkic folklore, a hero who humbled kings. In each retelling, the same paradox endured. He was both admired and abhorred. It is easy to condemn cruelty, harder to forget it. And Tamerlane's genius was that he made forgetting impossible. His violence was too organized, too theatrical to vanish. Every massacre came with witnesses, every ruin with records. He had planned not only his victories, but their documentation. And so the chroniclers became his accomplices. Even when they condemned him, they immortalized him. Every disgusted line of their writing served his true ambition, to be remembered. In one Persian chronicle, a writer confessed, "We record his crimes because not to record them would be a crime against truth." That is the trap Tamerlane built. Condemnation as preservation. The poets who survived him learned that too. They wrote verses about the impermanence of glory, about bones whitening under the sun, about the futility of kings. But the very act of writing kept his presence alive, the ghost in the margins. Even in modern times, his name resurfaces whenever power crosses the line from order to terror. Dictators study him, revolutionaries curse him, historians dissect him. Every generation resurrects him, each convinced that their age is immune to his log, and each proven wrong, because the architecture of fear doesn't require his armies anymore. It lives in systems, in surveillance, in the quiet obedience of those who prefer safety over truth. Tamerlane's towers may have fallen, but their blueprint remains, an invisible architecture repeating itself in every century. In the 19th century, explorers visited his mausoleum and wrote of the eerie calm within it, a single jade slab above his remains, unadorned except for a few words in Persian. This is the resting place of the mighty Sultan, the shadow of God. Even in death, he insisted on being half man, half divinity. But perhaps the truest shadow he left was not over cities, but over conscience. He forced history to ask questions it still cannot answer. How much cruelty can we admire if it's efficient? How much terror can we excuse if it's organized? At what point does civilization become indistinguishable from its conquerors? No historian has ever found a clean answer, because to condemn him completely would mean condemning the systems of empire, ambition, and fear that still shape our world. And history rarely condemns itself. Tamerlane's immortality lies there, not in the bones under Samarkand, but in the habits of power he perfected. Control through example, obedience through spectacle, order through annihilation. His skull towers have turned to dust, but their silence still teaches. Every ruler who governs by intimidation builds upon his foundation. Every citizen who confuses safety with submission adds another stone to his invisible monument. 600 years later, his story no longer belongs to historians. It belongs to everyone who still feels the weight of fear used as reason. Tamerlane may have erased 5 cities from the map, but in doing so, he carved himself into the atlas of the human mind. In 35 years, Tamerlane erased 5 cities from the map. He buried them street by street, body by body, and called it justice. The world called it order. But centuries later, as the dust settled over his ruins, a different truth emerged. He hadn't built an empire. He had built a ledger. Every massacre, every promise, every tower of skulls was a transaction recorded in history's account book. Profit, fear, expense, life, balance, silence. When he died, the arithmetic stopped, but the system he created didn't. It lingered, not in palaces or walls, but in the way power learned to think. Because what Tamerlane perfected was not war, it was management. He taught rulers that cruelty could be planned, that obedience could be automated, and that terror, when properly organized, could last longer than compassion ever could. That was the true empire he built, not of land, but of logic. And the question that haunted his chronicles still haunts ours. When civilization turns fear into administration, does it protect life, or does it merely own it? Look closely at the world he left behind. The borders have changed, the languages have shifted, but the pattern remains. Empires still count obedience in numbers, still weigh human cost against efficiency, still justify suffering as stability. The tools are cleaner now: paperwork, algorithms, drones. But the principle is identical. Power still believes that order requires fear, and that cruelty, if systematized, become rational. That belief began long before Tamerlane, but he gave it form, visible, tangible, unforgettable. He made horror measurable. He proved that a ruler could govern the imagination more effectively than the land itself. And history rewarded him for it, not with peace, but with permanence. His name endures not because of what he built, but because of what he broke. He is remembered precisely because he reduced the idea of civilization to its most naked equation. Fear equals function. The towers are gone. The barley fields have healed. The bones have turned to soil. But the silence, that deliberate silence, remains. It lives in archives, in footnotes, in the way we still describe violence as necessary. Some call that legacy strategy. Others call it survival. But whatever name we give it, we are still paying his debt. Because every age finds its own Tamerlane. Someone who builds order from destruction. Someone who calls terror a tool. Someone who claims that mercy must have rules. And every age believes, just for a moment, that it can control the fire without becoming it. The chronicles end with his death, but the ground does not. Archaeologists still dig up bones in places where his armies passed, their ribs twisted by the weight of earth. The soil remembers what the scribes tried to summarize. The earth does not exaggerate, It only records. And in that dirt lies the truest account of his empire. That fear, no matter how efficient, can never sustain itself forever. It devours until there is nothing left. No gold, no people, no meaning. Tamerlane's greatness was built on an illusion. That domination can create permanence, but permanence belongs to decay. His towers lasted decades. His terror lasted centuries. And yet, all that endures now is the memory of how quickly both turned to dust. If there is a lesson in his story, it isn't about conquest. It's about arithmetic, the kind that civilization keeps repeating. How many lives does it take to build peace? How much obedience equals stability? How long before order becomes its own form of ruin? We still don't know, because we are still writing in the same ledger. Tamerlane's empire fell 600 years ago, but the architecture of fear he designed is still standing, invisible, efficient, alive. Every government that prizes loyalty over truth, every system that rewards silence, every person who looks away because it's safer, each one adds another line to his unfinished account. And maybe that is the final terror of his legacy, that we've learned to call it civilization. If you value the record, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak.